Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other girls in her small Montana town. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall or watching movies, she could be found on her family's ranch, rifle in hand, practicing her marksmanship with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Her father, a former Marine sniper, had taught her to shoot when she was just 8 years old, and by 15, she could hit a beer can from 500 yards without breaking a sweat. The locals knew about Sarah's gift, but they treated it more like a party trick than anything serious. "That's our little Annie Oakley," they'd say with patronizing smiles when she won yet another county shooting competition. The men at the gun range would chuckle among themselves, watching this petite teenager outshoot hunters who'd been tracking elk for decades. They couldn't deny her skill, but they also couldn't quite take her seriously. Sarah's bedroom walls were covered with shooting medals and certificates, but what really caught visitors' attention was the detailed topographical map that covered most of one wall. Red pins marked various shooting locations across 3 states, with distances carefully calculated and weather patterns noted in her neat handwriting. She'd spent countless hours studying ballistics, wind patterns, and elevation changes, turning what others saw as a hobby into a precise science. Her mother worried about Sarah's single-minded focus. "You need to think about college, honey," she'd say during dinner conversations. "You can't make a living shooting targets." But Sarah had dreams that extended far beyond their small town. She'd read about military snipers who could make impossible shots, about competitions where the world's best marksmen gathered to test their skills against seemingly impossible challenges. The skepticism from her community only fueled her determination. When local hunters bragged about their 200-yard deer kills, Sarah would quietly mention the 1,000-yard shots she'd been practicing. They'd laugh, thinking she was exaggerating or didn't understand the physics involved. "Sweetheart," old Pete Morrison had said just last week at the hardware store, "even the military boys don't attempt shots like that except in movies." But Sarah knew something they didn't. She'd been documenting every shot, every variable, every minute detail in a series of notebooks that filled an entire shelf in her room. Temperature, humidity, wind speed and direction, barometric pressure, even the phase of the moon. She recorded it all. What others saw as impossible, she saw as a complex equation waiting to be solved. The turning point came during a family barbecue when her Uncle Jack, visiting from California, started telling stories about his hunting trips. Jack was known for his tall tales, and this evening was no exception. He described a shot he'd supposedly made across a canyon, claiming it was nearly a mile. The men gathered around the picnic table laughed and encouraged his storytelling. But Sarah could tell from the details that he was fabricating most of it. "That's nothing," Sarah said quietly, looking up from her corn on the cob. The conversation stopped and all eyes turned to her. "I've been working on calculations for a shot that would travel across state lines. With the right elevation and conditions, it's definitely possible." The silence lasted only a moment before the laughter erupted. Jack slapped his knee, nearly spilling his beer. "Oh, come on now, Sarah. That's not even physically possible. You're talking about what, 50 miles? 100? Even if you could get the bullet to travel that far, how would you even see the target?" Sarah's father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He knew his daughter better than anyone, and had seen her pushing the boundaries of what seemed possible for years. But even he had trouble believing what she was suggesting. "Sarah, honey, I think you might be getting a little carried away with the math." But Sarah wasn't deterred. She excused herself from the table and returned minutes later with one of her notebooks and a calculator. As the men continued to chuckle and shake their heads, she began showing them calculations, trajectory arcs, and environmental factors. Her uncle waved her away dismissively. "That's all just numbers on paper, kiddo. Real shooting happens in the real world, with real variables you can't account for." That night, as the guests went home and her parents cleaned up, Sarah sat on her bed staring at her topographical map. She traced a line with her finger from their ranch to a ridge she'd identified in Colorado, then to another peak in Utah. The distance was staggering, the variables almost infinite, but somewhere in her mind, she could see the possibility. She grabbed a red pen and marked a new location, writing a distance that would have made her Uncle Jack's fictional shot look like a beginner's practice round. The next morning, Sarah woke with a purpose that burned brighter than ever before. She'd spent years being underestimated, years having her abilities dismissed as cute rather than remarkable. The laughter from the barbecue still echoed in her ears, but instead of discouraging her, it had crystallized her resolve. She knew exactly what she had to do, and she knew it would require every ounce of skill, preparation, and determination she possessed. She pulled out a fresh notebook and wrote on the first page, "Project Ridgeshot, proving the impossible." Below that, she began sketching the first rough calculations for what would become the most ambitious shooting attempt anyone in their quiet Montana town could imagine. The men who laughed might call it unrealistic, but Sarah Mitchell was about to turn their skepticism into the motivation for something extraordinary. The weeks following the barbecue transformed Sarah into something resembling a mad scientist. Her bedroom became a command center filled with weather monitoring equipment, ballistic software running on her laptop, and detailed satellite imagery printed and taped across every available surface. She'd convinced her father to help her order specialized meteorological instruments, claiming they were for a school science project about climate patterns. Every morning before dawn, Sarah would climb to the highest point on their ranch with her equipment, recording atmospheric conditions with the precision of a research scientist. She documented wind patterns, temperature inversions, and barometric pressure changes, building a database that would make professional meteorologists jealous. Her mother found her asleep at her desk multiple mornings, surrounded by calculations and weather charts. The most challenging aspect wasn't the mathematics or the environmental factors. It was the logistics. The shot Sarah envisioned would require positioning herself on a specific ridge in Montana, while targeting a location over 2 states away. She'd identified the perfect setup, a natural rock formation that would provide the necessary elevation and stability, combined with a unique atmospheric corridor that could theoretically carry a projectile the impossible distance. Sarah began making weekend trips to scout locations, telling her parents she was visiting friends or participating in regional shooting competitions. In reality, she was hiking through remote wilderness areas with surveying equipment, GPS units, and her ever-present notebooks. She measured elevations, calculated sight lines, and identified potential obstacles that could interfere with her shot. The technical challenges seemed to multiply with each passing day. Traditional bullets simply wouldn't work for this distance. Air resistance and gravity would bring them down long before reaching the target. Sarah spent hours researching experimental ammunition, specialized powders, and custom barrel modifications that might give her the extra velocity and stability she needed. She even contacted ammunition manufacturers under the pretense of writing a research paper, gathering technical specifications that most recreational shooters never needed to consider. Her breakthrough came during a late-night session studying military sniper techniques. She discovered references to experimental long-range programs that had tested shots at distances far beyond standard combat ranges. While the details were classified, the basic principles were sound. Extreme elevation, specialized ammunition, and precise calculation of atmospheric conditions could theoretically extend effective range far beyond conventional wisdom. Sarah's notebook filled with complex formulas accounting for the Coriolis effect, bullet drop compensation, and wind drift calculations that spanned multiple climate zones. She learned that a bullet traveling the distance she contemplated would actually pass through different weather systems, requiring her to predict atmospheric conditions not just at her location, but along the entire flight path. The most frustrating part was her inability to share her progress with anyone. Her father would worry about the legal implications of attempting such a shot, even if it was technically on public land. Her friends wouldn't understand the scientific complexity involved, and the men who'd laughed at the barbecue certainly weren't going to take her seriously if she tried to explain the theoretical framework she was developing. Instead, Sarah found herself becoming increasingly secretive. She created encrypted files on her computer, used code names for locations in her notes, and even developed a personal shorthand for recording sensitive calculations. To anyone casually observing, she appeared to be an exceptionally dedicated student, working on various school projects. In reality, she was planning something that would challenge the fundamental assumptions about what was possible in long-range shooting. The turning point came when Sarah realized she needed to test her theories on a smaller scale. She identified a location about 10 miles from their ranch where she could attempt a shot that was still far beyond normal ranges, but achievable enough to validate her calculations. This test would require her to sneak out before dawn, hike to a remote location, and fire several rounds without anyone knowing about it. The night before her first test, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through every possible variable: wind speed, temperature gradients, humidity levels. Even the rotation of the Earth would affect her bullet's trajectory. She'd calculated and recalculated the physics involved, but theory and practice were two very different things. If her math was wrong, she'd know immediately. If it was right, she'd be one step closer to proving that the impossible shot could actually be accomplished. Her alarm went off at 3 in the morning, though she hadn't slept anyway. Sarah dressed quietly, gathered her equipment, and crept out of the house with the stealth of someone embarking on a secret mission. Her truck started with what seemed like a deafening roar in the pre-dawn stillness, but no lights came on in her parents' bedroom windows. As she drove through the darkness toward her chosen location, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror that she'd never experienced before. Everything she'd worked toward for months was about to be put to the ultimate test. The calculations were solid, the equipment was ready, and the conditions were as perfect as she could hope for. But there was still that nagging voice in the back of her mind reminding her that no one had ever attempted anything quite like this before. The men who'd laughed at her uncle's barbecue had called her dreams unrealistic. In a few hours, Sarah would find out if they were right, or if a teenager from Montana was about to rewrite the rules of what was considered possible in the world of precision shooting. Either way, there would be no turning back once she pulled that trigger. The test shot shattered every assumption Sarah had about her own abilities. The bullet struck within inches of her calculated impact point, 10 miles away on a hillside that most shooters would consider an impossible target. Standing alone on the ridge as the sun rose behind her, Sarah felt a surge of vindication that made her hands tremble. The mathematics worked. The physics were sound. The impossible was merely improbable. But the success of her test shot also revealed just how unprepared she was for the real challenge ahead. 10 miles was impressive, but the shot she'd been planning would travel over 100 times that distance. The variables would multiply exponentially, and the margin for error would shrink to nearly nothing. She needed better equipment, more precise calculations, and a level of preparation that would make her test shot look like child's play. Sarah spent the following weeks in a frenzy of research and acquisition. She sold her car to purchase a custom rifle built specifically for extreme long-range shooting, telling her parents she'd decided to take the bus to school instead. The rifle arrived in discreet packaging, and she stored it in a hidden compartment she'd built in the barn, along with the specialized ammunition that had cost her most of her college savings. The new rifle was a work of art, hand-built by a craftsman who asked no questions about why a teenager needed such specialized equipment. Every component was designed for maximum accuracy and velocity, from the custom barrel that could handle pressures beyond standard specifications to the precisely engineered stock that eliminated every possible source of vibration or movement. More challenging than acquiring the equipment was developing the software needed to calculate the shot. Sarah taught herself advanced programming, creating applications that could process thousands of variables simultaneously. Her laptop ran complex simulations day and night, calculating trajectory paths through multiple weather systems and accounting for atmospheric conditions that changed by the hour. The target location she'd chosen was equally remarkable. A natural depression in the landscape 3 states away that would be nearly impossible to hit by accident, but clearly visible from satellite imagery. Sarah had researched the area extensively, confirming that it was on public land with no risk to people or property. If her calculations were correct, the bullet would impact in a remote area where no one would witness the shot except possibly a few elk. As her preparations intensified, Sarah found herself living an increasingly double life. At school, she maintained her grades and participated in normal teenage activities, but her mind was constantly focused on ballistics calculations and weather patterns. Her parents noticed her distraction but attributed it to typical teenage behavior. Her friends assumed she was stressed about college applications. The breakthrough that convinced Sarah her plan could actually work came from an unexpected source. While researching historical long-range shots, she discovered a classified military experiment from decades earlier that had successfully fired a projectile across a similar distance under controlled conditions. The details were heavily redacted, but the basic confirmation that such distances were achievable gave her the confidence to proceed. Sarah began making reconnaissance trips to the shooting location, a remote ridge accessible only by hiking several miles through wilderness terrain. She cached supplies and equipment in hidden locations, building a support network that would allow her to remain in position for days if necessary. Weather patterns in the region were notoriously unpredictable, and she might need to wait for the perfect atmospheric conditions. The most nerve-wracking aspect of her preparation was the legal research. Sarah spent countless hours studying firearms regulations, land use restrictions, and potential legal consequences of her planned shot. While technically legal, the attempt would certainly attract attention from law enforcement agencies, who might not appreciate the scientific nature of her experiment. Her final test came during a family camping trip to Yellowstone. While her parents set up camp, Sarah hiked to a location she'd pre-selected and attempted a 30-mile shot using her new equipment. The target was a distinctive rock formation that she could barely see even through her high-powered scope. The shot required her to account for significant elevation changes, multiple wind currents, and atmospheric conditions that varied dramatically across the distance. When the bullet found its mark, Sarah knew she was ready. The mathematics were perfect, the equipment performed flawlessly, and her shooting technique had reached a level of precision that few people in the world could achieve. Standing on that mountain overlooking Yellowstone, watching the sun set over terrain that stretched to the horizon, she felt a quiet confidence that had been building for months. The final phase of preparation began immediately after returning home. Sarah created detailed contingency plans for every possible scenario, from equipment failures to unexpected weather changes. She studied satellite imagery of her target area until she could navigate the terrain in her sleep. Most importantly, she began the psychological preparation for what would either be the greatest achievement of her life or a spectacular failure witnessed by no one. The date was set for early autumn, when atmospheric conditions would be most stable and predictable. Sarah marked the day on her calendar with a simple notation that would mean nothing to anyone else but represented months of planning and preparation. In just a few weeks, she would attempt something that the experts considered impossible, something that would prove whether the laughter at that family barbecue had been justified or whether a teenager from Montana was about to make history. As she fell asleep each night, Sarah visualized every aspect of the shot: the feel of the rifle, the crosshairs settling on the distant target, the gentle squeeze of the trigger, and the long seconds of waiting to see if months of preparation would result in success or failure. Either way, she would soon know if her dreams were truly unrealistic, or if she was about to accomplish something that would silence the doubters forever. The morning of the attempt arrived with perfect weather conditions that seemed almost too good to be true. Sarah had been monitoring atmospheric patterns for weeks, waiting for the ideal combination of low humidity, stable temperatures, and predictable wind patterns across 3 states. When her weather monitoring software indicated that the perfect window was opening, she knew she had perhaps 12 hours before conditions would deteriorate. Sarah left home before dawn, telling her parents she was joining a friend for a weekend camping trip. The deception felt terrible, but she couldn't risk anyone trying to stop her or, worse, accidentally interfering with her carefully planned attempt. She drove for 6 hours to reach the base of the mountain, where she'd positioned her equipment cache, then began the grueling hike to the shooting position. The final approach to her chosen ridge required climbing nearly vertical rock faces and navigating through dense forests that hadn't seen human footprints in decades. Sarah carried only essential equipment, relying on the supplies she'd cached during previous reconnaissance trips. Every pound of weight mattered when facing a climb that would challenge experienced mountaineers, and she needed to conserve energy for the precision shooting that would follow. Reaching the shooting position felt like arriving at a different world. The ridge offered an unobstructed view across hundreds of miles of wilderness, with the target area visible as a tiny speck in the distance. Sarah set up her equipment with methodical precision, using techniques learned from months of practice and research. The custom rifle was assembled and calibrated. Weather monitoring instruments were positioned to track changing conditions, and her laptop began running final trajectory calculations. The target itself was barely visible even through her most powerful spotting scope. At this distance, atmospheric distortion created a shimmering effect that made precise aiming nearly impossible using traditional methods. Sarah had anticipated this challenge and developed a mathematical approach that relied on GPS, coordinates and calculated offset rather than visual confirmation of the target. As she settled into her shooting position, Sarah felt the weight of months of preparation and the skepticism of everyone who dismissed her abilities. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, but the magnitude of what she was attempting created a nervousness she'd never experienced before. This wasn't a practice session or a local competition, for this was an attempt to accomplish something that would challenge fundamental assumptions about the limits of precision shooting. The first challenge was simply getting the rifle pointed in the correct direction. At such extreme range, being off by even a fraction of a degree would result in missing the target by miles. Sarah used a combination of GPS coordinates, compass bearings, and astronomical references to establish her initial aim point, then made microscopic adjustments based on her ballistics calculations. Wind conditions required constant monitoring and adjustment. What started as a gentle breeze at her location translated into complex air currents that would affect her bullet's trajectory across multiple climate zones. Sarah had identified several key measurement points along the flight path and was tracking weather conditions at each location using online monitoring, stations, and satellite data. The ammunition she'd chosen represented the pinnacle of ballistics engineering. Each cartridge was hand-loaded with specifications that pushed the boundaries of what was considered safe, generating velocities that few rifles could handle. The bullets themselves were custom-designed projectiles that could maintain stability across distances that would cause conventional ammunition to tumble and lose accuracy. As the hours passed, Sarah made final adjustments to her calculations based on real-time atmospheric conditions. The mathematical model she'd developed was processing thousands of variables simultaneously, from the rotation of the Earth to microscopic changes in air density. Her laptop screen displayed trajectory projections that looked more like space mission planning than traditional shooting calculations. The moment of truth approached as atmospheric conditions reached optimal stability. Sarah's monitoring equipment indicated that she had perhaps a 30-minute window before changing weather patterns would make the shot impossible. Everything she'd worked toward for months was about to be tested in a single moment that would last less than a second. Settling behind the rifle, Sarah began her final pre-shot routine. Breathing exercises to control her heart rate, mental visualization of the bullet's flight path, and careful verification of every calculation and setting. The target was so distant that even confirming a successful hit would require satellite imagery or a several-day hiking expedition to the impact area. The silence on the ridge was absolute except for the gentle hum of her monitoring equipment and the almost inaudible whisper of wind through the rocks. Sarah had never felt more alone or more focused in her life. Months of skepticism and laughter had led to this moment when she would either vindicate her abilities or confirm that her dreams were indeed unrealistic. Through her scope, the crosshairs settled on the calculated aim point that represented her best estimate of where the bullet needed to travel. The mathematics were perfect, the equipment was functioning flawlessly, and the atmospheric conditions were as ideal as she could hope for. Everything was ready except for the final decision to pull the trigger and commit to a shot that would challenge everything the shooting community thought they knew about what was possible. Sarah's finger found the trigger as she prepared to attempt something that would either make her famous or confirm that some dreams really are too ambitious for reality. The bullet waiting in the chamber represented months of preparation, thousands of calculations, and the hopes of a young woman who refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. The rifle's recoil seemed anticlimactic after months of anticipation. Sarah felt the familiar push against her shoulder, heard the sharp crack of the shot echo across the wilderness, and then experienced the strangest silence of her life. The bullet was now traveling through space at speeds that defied imagination, following a trajectory that would either validate years of preparation or prove that some dreams really were impossible. For the first few seconds, Sarah remained motionless behind the rifle, as if her continued concentration could somehow guide the bullet to its target. She knew the projectile would travel for nearly 3 minutes before reaching the impact area. Assuming her calculations were correct, and atmospheric conditions remained stable throughout the flight path. 3 minutes had never felt longer in her life. Her monitoring equipment continued tracking atmospheric conditions in real time, and Sarah watched with growing anxiety as wind patterns began shifting slightly from her predictions. The bullet was committed to its path, But the air through which it traveled was a living, changing environment that could deflect even the most precisely aimed shot. Small changes in wind direction or air density could translate into massive deviations at such extreme range. While waiting for confirmation of impact, Sarah began the careful process of documenting everything about the shot. Temperature readings, wind measurements, barometric pressure, humidity levels, and dozens of other variables were recorded with scientific precision. Whether the shot succeeded or failed, the data would be valuable for future attempts or for understanding why the physics hadn't worked as expected. The biggest challenge was determining whether the bullet had actually reached its target. At such extreme range, Sarah couldn't see the impact through her scope, and the sound of impact would never travel back to her position. She'd prepared several methods for confirming the shot, including satellite imagery requests and a planned hiking expedition to the target area, but immediate confirmation was impossible. 40 minutes after taking the shot, Sarah's satellite phone received an automated message from a seismic monitoring station located near her target area. The message indicated a minor ground disturbance consistent with high-velocity impact had been detected in the precise location she'd calculated. While not definitive proof, it was the first indication that her bullet might have actually completed its incredible journey. The hike down from the shooting position gave Sarah time to process what she'd accomplished, assuming the seismic data was accurate. If successful, her shot would represent a breakthrough in long-range shooting that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was physically possible. The bullet had traveled through multiple weather systems across state lines, and through atmospheric conditions that should have made accuracy impossible. Returning to civilization felt like stepping back into a world that didn't understand what had just happened. Sarah drove home in a daze, her mind replaying every aspect of the shot while trying to comprehend the implications of what she might have achieved. The men who'd laughed at her ambitions had no idea that a teenager was potentially rewriting the record books while they went about their normal weekend activities. The most frustrating aspect was her inability to share the news with anyone. Sarah couldn't exactly call her parents to announce that she'd just attempted the longest rifle shot in history from a remote ridge 3 states away. The legal implications alone would trigger panic, even though her research had confirmed that the attempt was technically legal under federal firearms regulations. Instead, Sarah began the painstaking process of gathering confirmation data. She submitted requests for commercial satellite imagery of the target area, claiming to be conducting geological research for a college application essay. She researched hiking permits for the remote area where her bullet should have impacted, planning an expedition to physically verify the shot if necessary. The waiting was agony. Sarah maintained her normal routine at school and home, but her mind was constantly focused on gathering proof of what she'd accomplished. She monitored news reports from the target area, hoping for any mention of unusual occurrences that might confirm her bullet had reached its destination. She checked and rechecked her calculations, looking for any errors that might have affected the shot's accuracy. 3 days after the attempt, Sarah's satellite imagery request was approved and delivered electronically. With trembling hands, she opened the high-resolution images on her laptop, zooming in on the precise coordinates where her bullet should have impacted. The target area was a natural depression surrounded by rocky outcroppings, distinctive enough that any impact should be clearly visible from orbit. What she saw in the imagery made her heart race. A fresh impact crater, precisely where her calculations had predicted, surrounded by displaced soil and rock fragments that could only have been created by a high-velocity projectile. The crater was small but unmistakable, and its location matched her target coordinates within inches. The impossible shot had apparently succeeded beyond her wildest expectations. Sarah stared at the satellite image for hours, zooming in and out, measuring distances, and comparing the impact location with her calculated aim point. The mathematics had worked perfectly. The bullet had traveled across 3 states, through changing atmospheric conditions, and struck within a few inches of her intended target. She had accomplished something that the experts would have declared physically impossible. The realization of her success was overwhelming. Months of preparation, skepticism from her community, and calculations that pushed the boundaries of ballistic science had culminated in a shot that would challenge everything the shooting world thought they knew about long-range accuracy. Sarah had proven that impossible was just another word for untested, and she had the satellite imagery to prove it. But success brought new challenges. How could she reveal her accomplishment without facing legal scrutiny or media attention that might interfere with her normal life? How could she prove to the skeptics that a teenager from Montana had achieved something that professional snipers would consider fantasy? The shot itself was only the beginning of a much larger story that was just starting to unfold. The decision to reveal her accomplishment came when Sarah overheard the same group of men from the barbecue discussing a recent military sniper record that had made national news. They were impressed by a shot of just over 2 miles, calling it incredible and impossible to improve upon. Sarah listened quietly as they rehashed the same arguments about the limits of precision shooting, the same dismissive attitudes about what could be achieved with proper preparation and mathematical precision. Uncle Jack was holding court again, embellishing his hunting stories with increasingly dramatic details. "That military boy who made the 2-mile shot is probably the best marksman alive," he declared, gesturing with his coffee cup. "Nobody's ever going to beat that record. It's just not physically possible to shoot accurately beyond that distance." Sarah excused herself from the group and returned with her laptop, satellite imagery, and detailed documentation of her shot. The men looked up with polite but skeptical interest as she set up her materials on the hardware store counter. "I'd like to show you something that might change your perspective on what's possible," she said quietly. The initial reaction was predictable laughter. Jack glanced at the other men with a knowing smirk. "What have you got there, kiddo? More of those theoretical calculations?" But his expression changed as Sarah began displaying the satellite imagery, pointing out the fresh impact crater and explaining the mathematical precision required to achieve such accuracy. "Wait a minute," said Pete Morrison, leaning closer to examine the laptop screen. "Are you saying you actually attempted this crazy shot? When did this happen?" Sarah calmly explained the timeline, the months of preparation, and the perfect atmospheric conditions that had made the attempt possible. The men studied the satellite images with growing amazement, measuring distances and comparing the impact location with Sarah's calculated target coordinates. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. If Sarah's documentation was accurate, she had achieved something that redefined the boundaries of long-range shooting. The distance was so extreme that it challenged fundamental assumptions about ballistics, atmospheric effects, and human precision. Uncle Jack stared at the satellite imagery for several minutes before looking up with an expression Sarah had never seen before. "How far?" he asked quietly. Sarah pointed to her calculations showing the exact distance between shooting position and target location. The number was so large that Jack had to read it twice before understanding the magnitude of what he was seeing. "That's impossible," he whispered, but his voice lacked the dismissive confidence he'd shown during previous conversations. Word spread through their small town with the speed that only small communities can achieve. Within hours, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly with calls from local newspapers, shooting enthusiasts, and people who wanted to verify the story for themselves. The satellite imagery and detailed documentation made denial impossible, but the achievement was so extraordinary that many people struggled to accept it. The local gun range owner, a man who'd known Sarah since childhood, requested a private meeting to examine her evidence. He studied her calculations for over an hour, checking and rechecking the mathematics, examining the satellite imagery, and reviewing her meteorological data. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head in amazement. "Sarah, I've been in this business for 30 years and I never would have believed this was possible. You've just changed everything we thought we knew about shooting." National attention followed quickly. Shooting magazines requested interviews. Ballistics experts wanted to examine her calculations, and military officials expressed interest in understanding how a civilian had achieved something beyond their capabilities. Sarah found herself at the center of a firestorm of attention that was both exciting and overwhelming. The most satisfying moment came when a representative from the shooting sports industry contacted her to discuss the implications of her achievement. During the conversation, he mentioned that several experts had initially dismissed the reports as impossible, arguing that the physics simply wouldn't allow such accuracy at that distance. "But the evidence is undeniable," he said. "You've proven that we've been thinking too small about what's achievable with proper preparation and mathematical precision." Sarah's parents were initially shocked and concerned about the legal implications of her secret project. But as they examined her documentation and understood the scientific rigor behind her attempt, their worry transformed into pride. Her father, the former Marine who'd taught her to shoot, studied her ballistics calculations with professional interest. "I never imagined you'd take it this far," he said, "but the methodology is flawless. You've accomplished something that most military snipers would consider fantasy." The technical verification process took weeks as experts examined every aspect of Sarah's documentation. Ballistics specialists confirmed her calculations, meteorologists verified her atmospheric data, and satellite imagery analysts validated the impact evidence. Each verification added credibility to an achievement that initially seemed too extraordinary to believe. Media interviews became a regular part of Sarah's life as her story spread beyond the shooting community. She appeared on television programs, gave speeches at shooting sports events, and found herself representing a new generation of precision shooters who combined traditional marksmanship with advanced scientific methods. The shy teenager who'd been dismissed as unrealistic had become a spokesperson for pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible. The men who'd laughed at her ambitions during that family barbecue now found themselves quoting her achievement to anyone who would listen. Uncle Jack, in particular, had transformed from skeptic to Sarah's biggest supporter, proudly displaying printouts of the satellite imagery and detailed explanations of the physics involved. The same people who'd called her dreams unrealistic now bragged about knowing someone who'd accomplished the impossible. As Sarah reflected on her journey from skeptical teenager to record-breaking marksman, she realized that the most important lesson wasn't about shooting or mathematics or proving people wrong. It was about the power of refusing to accept limitations imposed by other people's understanding of what was possible. The laughter and dismissal that had once frustrated her had ultimately provided the motivation to achieve something truly extraordinary. 2 years after her record-breaking shot, Sarah stood before an audience of military snipers, ballistics engineers, and shooting sports professionals at the International Precision Shooting Conference. The same mathematical principles and methodical preparation that had enabled her impossible shot were now being taught to elite marksmen around the world. What had started as a teenager's response to skeptical laughter had evolved into a revolutionary approach to long-range shooting. The presentation she was delivering covered the scientific methodology behind extreme distance shots. But Sarah couldn't help thinking about how different her life had become since that autumn morning on the Montana Ridge. College offers had poured in from universities with strong physics and engineering programs. Military academies had expressed interest in her unique combination of theoretical knowledge and practical application. Shooting sports equipment manufacturers wanted her input on developing gear for the next generation of long-range marksmen. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the transformation in her hometown's attitude toward ambitious dreams. Young people who might once have been dismissed for having unrealistic goals now found encouragement and support for their seemingly impossible projects. Sarah's story had become local legend, proving that extraordinary achievements could come from careful preparation and refusing to accept other people's limitations. The technical impact of her achievement extended far beyond breaking distance records. Her mathematical models for calculating trajectory through multiple atmospheric zones had been adopted by military training programs. The meteorological monitoring techniques she'd developed were being used by competitive shooters worldwide. Even her approach to equipment customization had influenced firearm manufacturers to push the boundaries of what was considered practical for civilian shooters. During the question and answer session following her presentation, a young military sniper raised his hand. "Ma'am, what advice would you give to someone attempting to achieve something that experts say is impossible?" Sarah smiled, remembering the countless times she'd been told her goals were unrealistic. "Document everything. Trust your mathematics. And remember that impossible is usually just a word people use when they haven't done the necessary research." The media attention had eventually settled into a manageable routine of occasional interviews and speaking engagements. Sarah had learned to balance her newfound fame with maintaining a normal life, continuing her education, and developing even more ambitious projects. Her bedroom wall now featured a world map with potential shooting locations marked across multiple continents, each representing calculations that pushed the boundaries even further. The men from the hardware store had become unlikely celebrities. In their own right, proudly telling anyone who would listen about their connection to the girl who'd accomplished the impossible. Uncle Jack had framed the satellite imagery of Sarah's impact crater and hung it in his living room, where it served as a constant reminder that underestimating determined young people was a mistake he'd never make again. Sarah's relationship with her father had deepened as they collaborated on increasingly complex shooting projects. His military experience combined with her theoretical knowledge created a partnership that was attracting attention from research institutions and defense contractors. Together, they were exploring applications for her techniques in fields ranging from space exploration to atmospheric research. The original notebook where Sarah had first sketched her impossible calculations was now displayed in a case at the National Shooting Sports Foundation, representing a turning point in the evolution of precision marksmanship. Visitors could examine the pages filled with equations, weather data, and ballistics calculations that had seemed like fantasy to everyone except their author. College had provided Sarah with access to even more sophisticated modeling software and research resources. Her professors in the physics department were helping her develop mathematical frameworks that could predict optimal shooting conditions months in advance. The same methodical approach that had enabled her record shot was now being applied to research projects that could benefit fields far beyond shooting sports. The speaking circuit had introduced Sarah to other young people who'd accomplished extraordinary things in their chosen fields. She'd met teenage entrepreneurs, young scientists and artists who'd refused to accept age-based limitations on their ambitions. Together, they formed an informal network of people who understood that extraordinary achievements often came from ignoring conventional wisdom about what was possible. As Sarah concluded her presentation and thanked the audience for their attention, she reflected on the journey that had started with skeptical laughter at a family barbecue. The shot itself had taken less than 3 minutes to complete, but the preparation and aftermath had transformed her life in ways she never could have imagined. The ridge in Montana where she'd made history was now marked with a small plaque commemorating the achievement, though few visitors understood the significance of the location. The questions that once drove her to attempt the impossible had evolved into new challenges and even more ambitious goals. Sarah was already planning projects that would make her record-breaking shot look conservative by comparison. The same determination that had silenced the skeptics was now focused on achievements that would push the boundaries of human capability even further. Looking out at the audience of experts who hung on every word of her presentation, Sarah remembered the teenager who'd been dismissed as unrealistic for dreaming too big. The laughter that had once stung now seemed like the best motivation she could have received. Sometimes the greatest achievements came not from support and encouragement, but from the determination to prove that impossible was just another word for untested. The ridge shot that had started as a response to skeptical laughter had become the foundation for a lifetime of pushing boundaries and challenging assumptions. And in a world where young people were often told to be more realistic about their dreams, Sarah Mitchell stood as living proof that impossible was just another target waiting to be hit.